Hey everyone, this is Nick, and I'm not going to pretend that this did not happen. Some people hate their eyes, some people hate their teeth, their boobs, and they do something about it. Well, I hated that my hair was not sticking to my head, so I did something about it as well. I love it, my girlfriend really loves it, and my mom doesn't disapprove, so that's good enough for me. Anyway, this week we've got nightmare news as OpenAI says that they would be open to buy Google Chrome if Google had to sell it off. We also have the Cosmic Alpha 7, the last alpha before the beta, hopefully soon, and we also have Fedora deciding that they're gonna entirely ditch X11 packages for GNOME. Well, at least that's a proposal, but it's very, very likely. And we also have the segue to our sponsor. This video is sponsored by TuxCare. They offer excellent services to make sure that your Linux fleet stays maintained and secure, but without all the usual maintenance hassle, thanks to their multi-distro rebootless patching tool, which is called Kernel Care Enterprise, and with their endless lifecycle support services, you can get security patches for end-of-life Linux distros, for software languages, and for frameworks. Speaking of which, their endless lifecycle services now cover Ubuntu 20.04, which will reach end of life next month. After May, if you haven't upgraded to 22.04 or 24.04, you'll need to move to another support solution to keep getting security patches, or you're increasing your risk to get vulnerability exploits. Ubuntu Pro can cover that, but it's costly and it doesn't cover a lot of the components of your system. That support is also only good for 5 years. Fortunately, for more coverage and no deadline, you can opt for TuxCare's endless lifecycle support. They're significantly less expensive than Canonical's offering, and they not only cover all the CVEs for your Ubuntu 20.04 systems, but also an extensive list of packages. And since that support is endless, you're not pushing the deadline to upgrade or move to another system, you're effectively removing that deadline entirely. So if you are running any 20.04 systems, it is likely a bit too late to plan and prepare an entire migration to a newer LTS version, so do give a shot to TuxCare Endless Lifecycle Support by just clicking a link in the description of the video. So, if, like me, you were hyped about the potential of having Google be broken up by the US Department of Justice, potentially being forced to sell Chrome, you might turn around real quick on that, because OpenAI now says that they would buy Chrome if Google was forced to sell it off. Since Google has been found to violate antitrust laws, they might end up having to sell parts of their business, and Chrome seems to be the one that is most likely to be sold, Android second, if that of course ever happens at all. The issue is, if they have to sell parts of their business, then someone is going to buy parts of that business. And there are some other terrible actors for the web out there, not just Google, including AI companies. Nick Turley, ChatGPT's chief at OpenAI, said that they could offer a really incredible experience, where OpenAI could have the ability to introduce users into what an AI-first experience looks like, which does not sound good at all to me. He also said that they currently have very powerful competitors who control the entry points on how consumers access AI tools. They're probably referring to Google's payments to other companies to pre-install Gemini on Android phones everywhere, or the self-preference. Manufacturers generally give their own apps and solutions inside their own operating systems or app stores. As an example, Google reportedly pays Samsung enormous sums of money each month to have Gemini pre-installed on Samsung devices. That's a 2-year agreement that is precisely what Google was condemned for in the past, using their dominant position in the smartphone market to strike deals and to win even more market share in other markets, the very definition of abusing your dominant position. Personally, I am split on this topic. On the one hand, I love to see big tech companies be broken up. They have too much power over the internet, over everything we do online or on our devices, so having them forced to sell off some parts of their business makes sense. But on the other hand, there are other terrible actors out there, not just Google. You could have Chrome be bought by an AI company, which would be bad enough, but you would also maybe have that being bought by Microsoft or Oracle or someone else. It would absolutely suck. So I'm not really sure where I stand on this one. Now this week Cosmic got yet another alpha, Alpha 7, but apparently this time it's really the last one before the beta. They added the ability to interact more with workspaces, including moving them around, switching between a fixed number of workspaces or automatically creating new workspaces when you need a new one, naming those workspaces, pinning them to the list, basically just better workspace organization. Accessibility also has been improved quite a lot with a high contrast mode, with color filters for color blindness, color inversion, or the ability to switch to mono sounds to help people who have difficulty hearing from one ear or the other. Tooltips have been added in various places as well to add some instructions and some information, and they also added support for handling global system-wide keyboard shortcuts, although they are not using the modern keyboard shortcuts portal that everyone else uses. For now, they developed a sort of midway implementation where you can choose a few options for X11 apps, because Cosmic uses Wayland, of course, and so when you're running those X11 apps, you can grant them the permission to have those global shortcuts or not. It is off by default because it is less secure than the actual keyboard shortcuts portal. Fractional scaling is also improved with basically two modes, one that is optimized to scale applications, so less blurriness and crisper rendering, and one that is optimized for video games or full-screen content, where you basically let the full-screen app regulate the scaling that you use. You also now have type-ahead search in the file manager, so you can start typing a few letters on your keyboard and it will automatically filter the view with what you're searching for. You can change the left or right balance for speakers, and plenty of bugs were fixed as well. There's also added support for more Wayland protocols, there's performance improvements, and a lot of smaller touches and features all around the desktop. Now, once Cosmic has a final, stable version, it is very likely that I'm gonna move to it specifically as my daily driver, because I know GNOME and KDE and other desktop environments really well, but I'm not as familiar with this one, and since it's the new big thing landing in the Linux desktop world, it will be nice to give it a real shot by using it daily, probably on Pop OS, I guess. Now the end is nigh for X11 support on GNOME, at least in Fedora. A proposal for Fedora 43 has been submitted to remove support for X11 entirely on the GNOME edition of the distro, meaning only Wayland will be available as a session, and GNOME X11 related packages will not be included in Fedora's repos. Users that use GNOME with X11 on Fedora would be transparently migrated to a Wayland session instead, and this seems to echo GNOME's wish to completely remove X11 support in GNOME 50, so not the next version, but the one that lands next year in April. They're gonna start disabling X11 support at the compiler level for GNOME 49, and they're gonna start to uproot X11 code entirely, starting with GNOME 50, meaning there shouldn't really be any way to run GNOME on X11 in a year, unless someone forks and maintains that GNOME fork themselves. Since no one really will be dedicated to fix those X11 bugs on GNOME or to add new features to X11, the people behind the Fedora proposal feel like it's safer to just ditch X11 entirely. Now, X11 apps will still run on Wayland using X-Wayland, they're not removing that at all, and people who absolutely need X11 can move to another spin, another desktop like Plasma, Cinnamon, Mate, or anything else. Now, as usual with these proposals, it is just a proposal. It has to be confirmed by the Fedora steering committee, so maybe it's not going to go anywhere. But chances are, since GNOME really wants to ditch X11 relatively soon, over the span of a year, it is highly likely that Fedora will do the same, and it is also highly likely that other distributions will start kicking X11 to the curb, at least on their GNOME edition. Plasma will do the same at some point, but they said they would only make that move for Plasma 7, which is probably not going to release before 5 or 6 years, so you're kind of safer on that one. Now, speaking of GNOME, they published a really long blog post detailing all the work they've done on the Sovereign Tech Fund projects. This includes Newton, their new accessibility framework that is built to work with dbus and with a new Wayland protocol, so accessibility tools can work within sandboxed applications as well. All of that work is already integrated in a fork of GNOME OS and the GNOME Flatpak runtimes, so it's ready to be tested and potentially ready for inclusion when it is tested enough. Orca, the screen reader, was also modernized to have a much more legible codebase, and the way developers can make their app legible by Orca has been improved as well, with actual documentation to explain how that works. There's also some work done on libadwaita thanks to the STF, notably with bottom sheets, a little widget that provides a little page that slides up the bottom and can be swiped down to close it. You also have adaptive dialogues that resize properly on all screen sizes. You have multi-layout views, meaning the app can change how it looks depending on the window width or size. There are toggle groups that present various options in the same widget instead of having separate icons or a drop-down menu. In short, it is a lot of work on the GNOME graphical library to make better apps. Another project is the Notifications API, letting any app describe the icon, header, text formatting, buttons, and alert sounds that they want, and then any desktop is able to render this as a native notification that looks right at home on that desktop. V2 of this Notifications API is complete, and V3 already has a list of planned features. And in GNOME, all of that work has already landed in GNOME 48 and will keep going in GNOME 49 and GNOME 50 for the next versions of the API. Global keyboard shortcuts were another STF project. It landed in GNOME 48, and there were also improvements to the XDG desktop portals. They now handle USB devices and they have better documentation. Among other things, there was the Nautilus file chooser portal that we saw in GNOME 47, I think, more work on GNOME online accounts, more language bindings, more work on GNOME OS to try and make it into an actual full-featured operating system for developers, not just a very limited test bed. There's some work on immutable tooling as well, on a GNOME OS installer, on home directory encryption, which is completed but not merged yet, plus hardware-accelerated screen recordings that we've seen already, support for X-Well and fractional scaling, variable refresh rate, better performance in GNOME Shell, and more. All that work that we've seen starting with GNOME 46 all the way to GNOME 48. Now, back when GNOME announced that they were getting that €1 million grant, I remember a lot of people said it just wasn't enough to compete with the likes of Windows or macOS because these have multiple billions to invest in their desktops. The thing is, I think GNOME proved that 1 million is more than enough to do a lot, not only for GNOME, but for the entire Linux desktop ecosystem. They don't have middle managers to pay, they don't have progress reports to make for investors, they can just focus on spending the money on the actual work, not everything that goes around it, and it means that 1 million goes way further for GNOME or an open source project than it does for a startup or a big company. Now, we have some good news for open source graphics drivers. First, NVK is now Vulkan 1.4 conformant on Maxwell, on Pascal, and on Volta GPUs. So anything from a GTX 745 all the way up to the current RTX GPUs are supported with this driver, meaning the open source Vulkan driver that runs on top of the Nouveau kernel driver, or in the future on top of the Nova driver being developed by Red Hat. Well, this now supports a lot of Nvidia cards, not just the very latest. Now, they want to have NVK enabled by default for all these cards in Mesa 25.1, so in May, and the OpenGL drivers these cards use will be replaced by Zinc, which basically uses Vulkan to render OpenGL stuff in Mesa 25.2. For older GPUs, they might get support at some point, the work has already started on that, but they're not giving any specific time frame because there is a lot of work to do. Fermi cards might not be supported at all though, so cards from a GeForce 410M all the way to a GT 730 or 820M, these are apparently a lot trickier to get to work with Vulkan, so no guaranteed support on that one. This is all excellent news. I was afraid that this new open source stack, Nouveau or Nova plus NVK, would leave behind a lot of older Nvidia GPUs, but it looks like they're thinking about it. It looks like they're still supporting them. And honestly, supporting cards that are 6-7 years old is really not bad with these open source drivers. Props to the team. They're doing a good job. Now, Ubuntu is moving forward with their plan to replace some of their core utilities with Rust-based versions. In Ubuntu 25.10, a bunch of the GNU core utilities will be replaced by Rust core utils to make sure that they can test things ahead for Ubuntu 26.04. And I'm sure a bit of testing will not hurt, especially when you look at the recent Ubuntu releases. They had upgrade-breaking bugs, notably on Kubuntu, so testing these core utilities before shipping them in an LTS is probably a good idea. Now, these Rust-based utilities are a bit larger than the GNU ones, and when I say a bit, I mean a lot. They're 25 megabytes compared to the 7 megs the GNU utils take. So that's really a big jump in disk space and disk image size, to the point that a Docker image for Ubuntu would jump about 24% in size, and so they're probably going to stick to the GNU core utils. And if you're wondering what these utilities are, they are your core command line programs. They're chown, chmod, cp, dd, ln, ls, make, dir, move, rm, cat, all the stuff that you might use in script or that just make GNU the operating system layer on top of the Linux kernel. And you know what? At some point, maybe some people will want us to call it Rust/Linux instead of GNU/Linux. Now, looking online, I couldn't really find a big, strong rationale for moving to the GNU core utils to the Rust core utils. The GNU core utils aren't necessarily vulnerable to the sort of problems that Rust helps fix. They're also not slow, and the Rust versions aren't slower or faster. So that doesn't really seem to be a big focus or a big reason to move to those, apart from maybe preparing Ubuntu to migrate to more Rust-based tools in the future, and the core utils being such an integral part of the system, it makes it a good candidate to test out the transition from a non-Rust-based tool to a Rust-based tool inside of Ubuntu. I also saw some concerns on the Rust core utils being licensed under the MIT license, which is far more permissive than the GNU GPL, but I don't think that's really such a strong issue. Now, to conclude, we have yet another lawsuit against OpenAI, this time by the owner of CNET, PCMag, and IGN. Of course, for the same reasons everyone else sues OpenAI or AI companies, which is alleged copyright infringement. Ziff Davis, he's the owner of all of these outlets and a lot more, he says that OpenAI trained their AI models on the content of his websites, even though the robots.txt files of these websites told the OpenAI crawler not to crawl them or read the content. Now, the guy is no small fish. He has 45 media brands, he employs 3,800 employees, he is probably one of the biggest publishers to sue OpenAI at this point. So the suit alleges that OpenAI copied, reproduced, and stored the work of all the outlets Ziff Davis owns, and that it used that work to create responses in ChatGPT. Ziff Davis also apparently identified hundreds of full copies of the text of some articles of his websites. Now, as always, OpenAI says that they use public data, that it all falls under fair use, which I would argue it really doesn't, because fair use assumes no financial harm is done to the original content creator, and I don't see how OpenAI either completely copying or completely paraphrasing content at such a massive scale doesn't harm content creators. And at some point in the future, one of these lawsuits at least will be litigated, and we'll finally know, at least in the US, where justice stands on this fair use for AI companies kind of problem. I don't think it's really gonna go anywhere. I think it's taking far too long to reach a decision on this, and by the point these court cases will be litigated, AI will have been ingrained into modern society, and it will be way too late to ask those AI publishers to actually pay for all the content they licensed, because you can't really ask them to pay for the content they already started licensing, or they would all close up shop, because it is not a sustainable business model if you don't steal everything from everyone else. As always, public on the internet doesn't mean free to do as you please with, and that's the stance AI companies tend to take though. So, not sure where it's gonna go. What I hope is at some point they will be told that they have to pay for all the content, but I doubt it will ever happen. It's just taking way too long. Just like I was far too slow in bringing you this segue to our sponsor, Tuxedo Computers. If you've been listening to this show or watching any of my videos, you know about Tuxedo Computers. They make laptops and desktops that ship with Linux out of the box. They have a pretty big range that will fit every price point and every need. They're based in Germany, but they ship to most countries in the world. They have tons of keyboard layouts to choose from, and you can even add your own custom one. You can have your own custom logo engraved on the lid of your laptop, and they have plenty of different components you can pick from and plenty of different models. If you want reviews, my YouTube channel has plenty of those as well. I only use Tuxedo computers these days. Everything I do related to Linux is done on one of their laptops. Everything I do related to gaming is done on one of their desktops. So if you need a new computer, you want to run Linux on it, and you want to give your money to a company that actually supports Linux, then click the link in the description and check out Tuxedo computers. They're really good. Anyway, this will conclude today's episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it or listening to it. You know where all the YouTube buttons are. Click them, leave a comment, whatever. You know how things work. And if you want to support the channel, there are links in the description as well. Thanks for watching, and I guess you'll see me in the next one. Bye!